The Spitfire, you put it on like a suit. It was wonderful.
I think my preference is really for the Spitfire.
When you got into a Spitfire, you felt a part of it.
British Fighter Command might have appeared like an almost gossamer-thin protection when the German bombing raids on southern England and London started in May 1940, with the Hurricanes and particularly the Spitfires being in short supply. The people would owe a great debt to a handful of young, courageous fighter pilots who refused to accept the odds-on offer. The Supermarine Spitfire, to give its proper name, was an aircraft with some considerable pedigree, developed from the Supermarine floatplane that was designed to participate in races for the Schneider Trophy. The small Supermarine Aircraft Company had two vital ingredients at their disposal: the designer, R.J. Mitchell, and the renowned Rolls-Royce engine. The combination proved one of the biggest successes in aviation, as the Supermarines dominated the Schneider Trophy races during the 1920s and 30s, setting new speed records at virtually every outing. The first victory came in 1927, when the S-5 reached a top speed of 280 miles per hour. In 1929, the famous S-6 repeated the victory and exceeded 328 miles per hour. And in 31, the S-6B, fitted with a Rolls-Royce engine, bettered 340 miles per hour during the race, and achieved more than 400 miles per hour in a separate speed test. The Supermarine's pedigree, combined with an even better Rolls-Royce engine, the V12 Merlin, capable of producing at least 1,000 horsepower, was an ideal platform for developing a fast fighter plane. And the Spitfire Type 300, the prototype, was completed in 1936. The Spitfire Mark I went into production almost immediately, and a total of 1,583 were delivered to the RAF. The first entered service in July 1938 with 19 Squadron at Duxford, and it was the Mark 1A that was to equip most Spitfire squadrons during the Battle of Britain. The 20s and 30s had been tense and contrasting decades. Charleston, Rudolph Valentino. Depression. Daring stunts, risking life and limb to make a crust, and the aeroplane doing the sideshow. In contrast, international air travel was becoming commonplace, the market being opened by companies such as Imperial Airways, that would transport their clients in some considerable comfort to exotic destinations throughout the globe. For the first time, relatively cheap mass-produced airplanes, like the Moth here, made flying both accessible and popular. Flying clubs were established throughout Britain. Not unnaturally, a career in the Air Force became attractive to many young men.
I joined in January 1936. I learnt to fly as a schoolboy at 15, 16. My father decided this enthusiasm I'd had as a child. I used to make and fly little model aeroplanes and so on. That the best way to cure this was to let me learn to fly, and then I'd settle down and join the family business. And so I learnt to fly, and then, without telling him, put in an application to join the Air Force, got some papers calling me for interview, and that was it, and I was in. I would have been approaching in 18 or just 18.
The young RAF pilots then enjoyed intensive training, first in the safe biplanes and later in faster monoplanes like the Gauntlet, the Hurricane, and from 1938, the Spitfire.
I had joined the Air Force as a career. Not that I particularly wished to fight or anything, but I thought flying fighter aircraft and doing aerobatics was a wonderful way to live.
But things were about to change dramatically. Quite contrary to the Versailles Treaty, Germany had been rearming at an alarming rate, and it must have been obvious to anybody, except the most gullible politician, that war was on the cards, particularly after the Austrian Anschluss and the subsequent invasion of Czechoslovakia. German troops crossed the Polish border on the 1st of September 1939, and when Great Britain and France 3 days later declared war on Germany, the Second World War was a reality. Overseen by Hitler personally, German panzer divisions supported by Luftwaffe bombers and Stukas, the infamous dive bomber, demonstrated the concept of blitzkrieg to the world, performing a swift and efficient pincer movement that in reality put pay to any serious Polish resistance within a couple of weeks. There was little activity after Poland, a calm period. The phony war lasted through to the 10th of May 1940, when two things changed. The Germans' offensive in the West, and Churchill replaced Chamberlain as British Prime Minister. The Allies were at war.
We went to France when the balloon went up on the 10th of May. We started in Belgium. We operated from an airfield in Belgium. Purely by day, went back to Biggin Hill at night. There was no backing there, it's absolute chaos. We were having to refuel our own aircraft from tins. We were having to hand start them on the starting handles because we had no mobile batteries. We couldn't get any real orders from anybody. Telephone lines were down, there was confusion. I think the Air Force headquarters was constantly on the move, falling back. And finally, of course, that all stopped, and the French thing was packed up.
The Germans' campaign in the Low Countries and France was virtually as successful as had been the case in Poland, and despite fierce resistance by the British Expeditionary Force, they were steadily being pushed back to the Channel port of Dunkirk, where more than 300,000 Allied troops were famously evacuated, leaving tons of valuable hardware behind. Eventually, German troops could parade through the L'Arc de Triomphe in Paris, and Hitler could contemplate an invasion of the British Isles. Helmut Goering believed that the first objective had to be to destroy British shipping in the English Channel, and felt that his Stukas were the ideal weapon to do the job. The Stuka squadrons did enjoy a great deal of success in the Channel, whilst the British forces were regrouping and preparing for the invasion that everybody knew was bound to follow. But now Goering made the greatest blunder of his military career. Whilst German forces were waiting for the signal, relaxing in northern France, Goering persuaded Hitler that his Luftwaffe could destroy all British resistance given half a chance, and his overconfidence in the aging Stukas made him deploy them strategically. He sent them on raids against targets in southern England, where they met the Hurricane and the Spitfire.
Well, I personally didn't come across Stukas until they did a raid on Dover one day, and it was a turkey shoot, literally. All you had to do was get behind them, make sure you didn't overshoot them, and get in front. So you had to shut the throttle, and they'd got to pull out at the bottom, and there was a lovely plan view of an aeroplane. Lay on deflection, bang, no trouble at all.
The Stuka squadrons kept coming, attacking vital harbour installations throughout the south coast of England. But Fighter Command were now more than up to the task of dealing with the situation and inflicted heavy casualties. Ultimately, the Luftwaffe didn't achieve their objective. Supplies were still getting through, and the cost for the Germans was mounting. This was the right time to put some heart into not only fighter pilots, but the whole nation, and Winston Churchill addressed the nation.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on beaches, landing grounds, in fields, in streets, and on the hills. We shall never surrender.
And Great Britain was indeed preparing for the fight. The Home Guard was in intense training. Bomb shelters were being constructed, roadblocks established, barrage balloons put in place, and the women were riding dispatch, working in factories, cooking, and manning anti-aircraft guns. And the RAF were recruiting, knowing only too well that many very young men would be lost in the next few months, and they had to be replaced.
I was 18 and a half when I joined. Well, I at the age of 19, and with the Battle of Britain sort of just beginning to start, I thought it was time that I did something about leaving my little job in the grocery trade and joined the Air Force. And I was fortunate enough in my sort of first interviews in July 1940 to be accepted. I knew I'd got to do something to help the war effort, and I didn't want to drown at sea, and I didn't want sticking with a bayonet, but I did know that if I flew in an aeroplane, there was a very good chance that I would descend from 20,000 feet in a spiral dive and hit the ground a bit fast, and that was a quick way out for me, and that's the way I want it in the end.
Barely out of school, but prepared to commit themselves to a fight that was just beginning and with no immediate end in sight.
Supermarine calling. Planes heard 3 miles southwest.
Radar, listening posts, and observers were tracking the movement of incoming enemy planes. Then, scramble. The task facing the fighter squadrons was not only to stop the German bombers getting through, but to deal with their fighter escort, predominantly the Messerschmitt 109, a fighter plane that compared well with the Spitfire of the day. There was some support from coastal anti-aircraft batteries, but the real fight was to take place in the air above the southern counties, and it was to become the most bitter air battle the world has ever seen. It was the beginning of the Battle of Britain.
Claims, Johnny?
109 destroyed, Freddie, yes.
Oh, good show.
Inevitably, a number of German bombers made it through and unloaded their bombs on British airfields, but often to little effect, as the RAF had decided to disperse their planes wherever possible, hiding them. And of course, the Spitfires had a second chance to get at the German bombers on their way back. Proper planning was often difficult with limited resources.
We were invariably launched late by the controller, who waited to see the build-up of the formation coming in on the early warning radar. And of course, what he was wanting to know was, is this a spoof raid to draw all my fighters into the air? And then it turns around and goes home, and so all my fighters are on the ground refueling when the main raid comes in, catches them all on the ground. So he waits to make sure that it really is a genuine raid, not a spoof, and then he launches you. So you're late. And we used to complain bitterly about this, that we were struggling for height at full throttle all the time, climbing up to try and get at these chaps up there, instead of having the advantage of being up there waiting for them. And it almost invariably happened, and so you had that disadvantage until you decided one thing that worked terribly well was take the bomber formation head on. And of course the Heinkels, for example, was, well, it was like a great greenhouse in the front end, with the bomb aimer sitting there and the pilot sitting, driving, looking around, and so on. They didn't like it much when they saw you coming head on with your guns all going. It put them off quite a lot, and it was very effective because, of course, you could hit the crew.
Luftwaffe losses were considerable. The southern English countryside literally littered with wrecks, not forgetting the lost crews, killed or taken prisoner.
Air Ministry communique. The biggest bag yet. 185 enemy aircraft shot down.
Mr. Hitler was not pleased and decided to target London to teach the English a lesson, break the spirit. And now London prepares, evacuating the children to the safety of the countryside and blacking out the city. Then wait to sit it out. Fighter Command's resources are now stretched to the limit, and the pilots have made more sorties without break than had ever been envisaged. But still, they had to face the onslaught. The danger of invasion was still very real. they carry on.
Hello, gunfire in the southeast.
The German bomber squadrons arrive in unprecedented numbers and penetrate the British fighter defence and break through to the home counties and London, and the city goes underground.
Roof reports planes coming in. Control room speaking.
Customers and staff will now take cover in the basement. Please do not run, but keep moving.
Down the stairs, or you can use the escalator.
London is not directly a military target, but if the Germans can paralyze the city and the civil administration, they will have gained a considerable tactical advantage. But the city is fighting back in its own way. There is no choice, really, but to ride the attacks and survive.
Doorstep. Oh, what a spread.
Again, the fighter planes are ready to attack the Germans as they make their return journey. Bombers and fighter support are jumped upon from every conceivable angle. And somebody must keep score. The German losses continue to mount, but the destruction of London is devastating. Thousands of civilians have been killed and thousands more wounded. And the RAF also suffered considerable losses.
Interestingly, of that pre-war squadron, nobody was actually killed. There were chaps shot down, they were burnt, they were wounded, but nobody was actually killed. All the people we lost were the new boys who arrived in the very early days of the war, and really, they hadn't got the background, they hadn't got the training, unfortunately there wasn't the time, and they were the ones who bought it in the main.
The Spitfire had lived up to the very highest expectations in its first serious combat confrontation with the enemy, and had become very popular with the pilots. They all developed a special affection for the plane.
The Spitfire to me was a very, very efficient, smooth airplane. It was fast, it was a little bit, I think it was a little bit more difficult to handle than the Hurricane, which I'd flown quite a lot of.
Actually, I flew both. I flew the Hurricane in training and also the Spitfire. I think my preference is really for the Spitfire. The Hurricane was very manoeuvrable, especially in the turning circle. It could out-turn a Spit. But the Spit was faster.
And aren't we lucky to be flying the best aircraft in the best air force?
In Berlin, a furious Adolf Hitler summons Helmut Göring and demands not only an explanation, but a solution. We may not know the former, but the latter was night bombing. A final German attempt to defeat the stubborn British by air power alone is mounted. Though not at peak efficiency in the dark, the fighters are still there, and the anti-aircraft batteries protecting the city have been extended and now offer some considerable protection.
Hostile raids, sir.
But there is no immunity from enemy bombing raids, and the city is hit, and fires light the skies during most nights in the late fall and early winter of 1940. When the all clear is given, the citizens emerge from their lairs and carry on, just carry on.
Good morning, Mr. Arms. See you tonight. Right here. Come on, Betty. Would you like to sit down? Thanks.
Morning, Mr. Arns. Sleep well?
Fine, thanks. Wasn't it a quiet night?
What about the one that came down about 2?
I didn't hear it. Did you? No.
Oh, we're getting used to them around here.
The price for London was high, in destruction and in thousands more lost lives. But the city survived thanks to the spirit of its people and the unrelenting efforts of the armed forces, not least the young men, boys, that flew the Hurricanes and the Spitfires. The Battle of Britain had been won.
Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
The immediate danger to Great Britain might have been averted, but the Germans were still in the ascendancy on the continent, and Fighter Command's job was still an important one.
And at that time, the RAF and Fighter Command in particular was taking a more offensive role, and we were engaged in doing sweeps over the English Channel.
And the Messerschmitt 109 was still there, being constantly improved, as was the Spitfire.
They started off and really very comparable in terms of performance, the Messerschmitt 109 and the Spitfire of the day. Then the 109 would get a slight technical advantage which would push it slightly ahead, which would probably be the instigation for our people at home to give us a slightly better advantage, and we leapfrogged in that sort of fashion. So really, there were times when the Spitfire was lagging behind in fighter terms.
The 109 did have one distinct advantage over the Spitfire, direct fuel injection, which allowed it to get out of trouble by going into a sudden steep dive without the loss of fuel supply to the engine.
If we tried the same thing, we got a temporary starvation of fuel in the carburetor, and then the engine picked up in the dive. But by then, of course, you'd lost valuable space and time. He'd pulled away and you were left far behind. The only way you could combat that was do a half roll and pull the stick back, and then do an aileron turn down and you were still behind him. Quite often, in the Battle of Britain in particular, and later on, of course, over France, the 109 tactic was to come diving down on you, have a squirt at you, and then just carry on down. And he was going fast, and he knew it was going to take you a long time to build up speed to catch him, even if you started diving straight away. And by which time he was miles ahead and out of range, and he would then zoom, climb back up into the gods again.
It was inevitable that a fair amount of the air combat took place over open water, and considering the value of a fighter pilot, after all, he cost some £20,000 to train, compared to the cost of a Spitfire of only £5,000. Air-sea rescue became of some importance to Fighter Command.
And we were going past St. Peter Port when heavy flak was fired at us. And the next thing I knew, my engine stopped. which I throttled back, and I was trying to decide whether to bail out or try and force land on Guernsey. Although, from what I've heard later, it would have been probably suicidal to have tried to land on Guernsey because they had so many obstacles to prevent aircraft landing there. I pushed the throttle wide, and with that the engine picked up. So I thought, well, I must have panicked. So I throttled back slowly again. But when I got down below about 9 pounds of boost, the engine cut again. The radar, who were controlling us, picked up my message and gave me an immediate steer to Bolt Head. And they sent some Air Sea Rescue Spitfires who were associated with Warwicks, which carried a lifeboat underneath. A Spitfire ditching was not advised, and lots of chaps were killed. The choice really was to jump. Quite a few were rescued because they used to send the walrus. They used to send the walrus out to pick chaps up.
I do think that there are people that are bound to survive, or more likely to survive than others. A warrant officer rang me who was a walrus pilot. Warrant Officer Bird, his name was, Canadian. And he said, Mr. Berryman, because I was all of a flying officer by this time. So he said, Mr. Berryman, he said, I'm a crew short, and is there any chance you could fly with me this morning? We've got an operation just coming up, and I've got to take off, and I haven't got one bloke in my crew that should be with me. So I said, okay, I'll come, but I didn't fly the walrus, and I'd only ever sat in it just for fun, but I had nothing to do with flying it. So I went along on this particular operation on a quick scramble to attempt to save a pilot who had gone into the sea about 30 or 40 miles south of the Isle of Wight. And we knew he was a Spitfire pilot, and we were quickly vectored by operations to a position where he was likely to be. And after about 20 minutes, we found this guy in the water floating in his Mae West. The walrus pilot, Warrant Officer Bird, put the walrus down. The sea was fairly rough, but he got it down okay, and he managed to taxi to fairly near this poor guy. He seemed to be waving his arms and needing help. There was no way you're going to leave that guy to die if I could do anything about it. Having tried to fish him out once, I quickly literally leapt overboard and swam to him. I shouted words of encouragement to him and hoped that I was helping him. The float of the airplane cracked me over the head, so I was a bit stunned. It probably kept me alive being a bit stunned. But anyway, I inflated his Mae West, and the walrus, the Air Sea Rescue amphibian, had completely disappeared from view, and there we were floating about in the English Channel. But I knew by this time this other fella had died. I knew he was dead. And by that time, I was pretty well far gone myself, and I was, I think, lucky to be rescued myself. Fortunately, they spotted us again, and they came to try and pick me up. If you can possibly go in and help a mate, and this was a fellow Spitfire pilot, I couldn't leave him to die without trying to do something.
Between 1942 and 1945, more than 2,000 pilots were rescued by the Air Sea Rescue Unit. With his invasion plan in tatters, Hitler looked east and south. Despite his non-aggression treaty with Stalin, the Führer and his generals had been planning Operation Barbarossa, the attack on the Soviet Union, for months. And on June 22, 1941, the panzer divisions crossed the borders and a new phase of the war had started. The Germans had begun the biggest military confrontation in history. In North Africa, General Montgomery and Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had embarked on what was to become a long and sustained struggle. The ultimate goal, the control of the Middle Eastern oil fields. The Germans enjoyed in 1941 and 42 both naval and air superiority in the Mediterranean, and the only Allied stronghold near the field of battle was the island of Malta. And the forces there needed all kinds of help, including fighter and photo reconnaissance planes. Photo reconnaissance was to become an important task for the Spitfire, and special units were developed to carry out the job. A hazardous one, as it turned out.
I was instructed to go down to Benson and pick up a photographic reconnaissance Spitfire and fly it to Cairo. And I obviously wasn't very pleased about this because, A, I couldn't believe a Spitfire could fly that far. But having got to Benson and seen the PRU Spitfire, which of course was quite different from a fighter Spitfire, it had no guns, no armor plating, and all the leading edges of the machine were filled with petrol. And so a flight of 1,000 miles was quite feasible. And I then flew down to Cornwall, and there we were briefed at about dawn the next day to fly to Gibraltar. And I can remember the briefing we received was, well, very sort of short and sweet, really. He just said, well, you know, I don't know what to say to you chaps. The track to Broadstairs is about 190, and when you get to Gibraltar, make sure you fire the colour of the day, because the Navy have never seen Spitfires before and are more likely to shoot you down than allow you to land.
This particular PRU, short for Photo Reconnaissance Unit, made it through, and was fed and housed and flew on to Malta the following day to start his stint of collecting aerial intelligence. Malta was literally an island under siege, and a thorn in the flesh of the Germans, who did their best to dislodge the Allied forces. The Germans also took advantage of their air superiority to prevent vital supplies to reach the entrenched forces on Malta, whilst their own ships and transport planes had a free run into North Africa to support Rommel's Afrika Korps. The battle for Malta, the Allies' fight for survival in the Mediterranean, was to become second only to the Battle of Britain in magnitude. And many Battle of Britain pilots faced much the same challenges as they had done on home ground earlier in the war. The German bombers and the Messerschmitt 109s. The airfield at Gibraltar had become a collection point for new Spitfires destined for Malta, but it was the last leg that would prove to be the most hazardous and by far the most costly.
When we had some of the Spitfire reinforcement Spitfires coming in, the Germans were just waiting for them, and as they landed, the 109s would go up the runway and shoot them up, and by the next day, out of the 36 aircraft that might have flown in, you might have had 10 that were still serviceable. The others had either been damaged by bombs or were unserviceable from the trips.
This was the environment in which the PRUs had to do their job. Record enemy shipping. Verify troop movements. Building of airfields and other bases whilst being pursued by upset Germans. The collected intelligence was invaluable and helped the Allies in creating military parity and ultimately air superiority in the Mediterranean, which made Operation Torch possible, the landing of a large Allied force in North Africa on the 8th of November 1942, that led to the battle and victory in the Battle for Tunisia and the end of any German presence in the area. In Europe, an Allied invasion is becoming increasingly likely, and Fighter Command is keeping up the pressure, attacking harbour installations and troop and equipment trains. But without attracting the interest of German fighters, they were content playing a waiting game. Something had to be done.
So I got the chaps together in the wing and said, no, we've got to somehow try and trick them into action. And we thought of all sorts of ideas. And the only one that was obvious was the old First World War one, that you put a decoy down. So we got 4 volunteers, one of whom was an Australian, and said, right, we will follow you round behind Paris, and we will sit 5,000 feet above you. And then suddenly they were jumped by about 10 109s. And the Australian in the decoy had got into a bit of a panic, and he switched his radio on and was shouting, for Christ's sake, come and give me a hand. I've got 4 of the bastards shooting at me. And his voice was getting high-pitched. You could sense the terror, virtually. My Australian number 2 came on the air. Very quiet, soft Australian voice saying, what's the matter, Harry boy? Are they picking on you?
The build-up of equipment and supplies in southern England prior to the Normandy landings was gathering momentum. Planes, trucks, tanks. Men were being trained and retrained, all supervised by the Allies' 2 main strategists, General Eisenhower and Field Marshal Montgomery. Spitfire squadrons were being kept busy. They were, amongst other things, given the task of attacking enemy communications and transport, bridges, trains, and, not least, airfields. It was, not unnaturally, also the task of Fighter Command to supply fighter cover for bombing raids into Germany, particularly when daylight raids became more commonplace.
When we went to the Ruhr, we were always top cover because we were pressure cabin. And down below, these bombers, I take my hat off to them, the flak, as the bomber pilots used to say, was so thick you could get out and walk on it, and looking at it, it was a terrible box barrage.
The bombing raids were to continue to the last days of the war, but fighter support became less important, with the Luftwaffe running short of supplies, planes, and crews. The 6th of June 1944, D-Day, and more than 200,000 American and British troops landed in Normandy, first to establish a vital bridgehead and then to commence the long drive towards Germany. It was an operation that had been planned in the smallest detail and which succeeded beyond the Allied commander's greatest expectations. The Luftwaffe had introduced the Fokker-Wulf 190, a superb aircraft and infinitely superior to the 109. But it was too little, too late, and the Spitfires and their experienced pilots dealt with them in a routine fashion, though not without losses. Torpedo bombing of German Navy vessels had been routine since 1942, but was virtually always carried out with fighter cover, a dangerous task, as it was the job of the Spitfire to fly anti-flak, trying to keep the German ack-ack off the bombers.
An anti-flak, there was no cover, there were no trees to hide behind, and you were taking things head on. They were shooting straight back at you. An anti-flak, we used to draw lots as to who was to be the anti-flak squadron. And when we drew the short straw, I used to think, oh Christ, I wonder if I can cope with this, because this is going to be terrifying. The hail of metal these chaps throw at you from their ships, which you have to go straight through and far away, and hope that you can keep them occupied and let the torpedo boys get in there.
The Spitfire had performed its task throughout the war magnificently, not only during the Battle of Britain, but wherever it went. Tunisia, France, Greece, through to the fall of Berlin. And the pilots, let us never forget the pilots.
I knew, certainly by the beginning of 1944, that it was very, very doubtful whether I would survive the war. I knew that.
I think the moment of real sorrow is really when you come back and find the empty bed.
Well, you knew it wasn't going to happen to you. So when it happened, the chums, you went to the photograph of the squadron, which was hanging on the wall. Hadn't been framed, it was just one of these usual photograph things. And he said, "Ah, Christ, poor old Tom." So you got your pen and drew a couple of horns out of his ears, saying he's on the way down, too bad.
In the mess, we used to virtually joke about it.
I think we all of us probably strapped ourselves in and thought, well, he might get it, but not me. That's if you ever thought of it at all. I think you just accepted the fact that you would be back again.
We were there. We were dispensable. We could be disposed of.
I reckoned then that my luck wasn't going to hold out. I didn't know how much longer the war was going to last, but I didn't reckon, after all my ops starting, war declared, if you like, I didn't reckon my luck was going to hold out.
It says, dear Mum and Dad, literally, I need to write a few words to say what a super mother and father you've been to me, and I thank you for everything you've ever done. And if this letter is ever posted, which I sincerely hope it's not, that you will know that I do go out fighting for what I believe in, and that is ultimate victory for England.